So we're really delighted to have an amazing technologist and public servant. Here's our keynote speaker, Michael Kratsios. Served as the 4th Chief Technology Officer of the United States at the White House and Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the Pentagon. And under his leadership, the White House reoriented technology policy towards an explicit primary focus on ensuring continued American leadership in emerging technologies. And he's continuing that work in the private sector now as a managing director at Scale AI, a leading corporate strategy and accelerating AI applications across industries there. And also, he has the distinction of being the youngest ever Senate-appointed Undersecretary of Defense. And then he's going to be sitting in conversation with another amazing scholar and thinker in this space. Jamil Jaffer is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and the Cyber Tech Center at George Mason Law School, the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason University, where he is also an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy and National Security Law, Policy, and Cyber. And he's also, in his spare time, a venture capital partner at Paladin Capital Group, a leading global multi-stage investor that identifies, supports, and invests in innovative companies that develop promising early-stage technologies to address critical cyber and advanced technological needs of commercial and government customers. So we have two real thought leaders in the space and some people who can speak to national security not only through the kind of narrow lens of focus on defense or DoD applications, but really across the entire national and international landscape. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Jamil.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us, and I'm thrilled to be here with Michael, and talking about what is probably one of the most exciting areas of innovation today in the American economy and the world economy as it stands. So, Michael, I want to start right at the top, which is, there's been a lot of talk over the last year and a half that generative AI has set the public consciousness about how we should think about generative AI, its impact on workers, its impact on the economy, its impact on our economic and national security. And we have a group of very prominent AI thinkers, a group of very prominent AI innovators, some leaders of companies in this domain, have come out and signed on to a sort of one sentence or a couple of sentence statement that essentially says, in sum, that we should treat AI like a challenge on the scale of a pandemic or nuclear weapons. What is that right?
I did. I did not sign on to that letter, and
neither did I.
my general view is that I believe that's pretty overblown. And obviously, with any new emerging technology, there are risks, and a lot of the risks that are enumerated in some of these letters and other documents kind of fall in what I would call these sort of like long tail or sort of like X risk or existential risk. And the question always comes up when you're doing this analysis is sort of like, what is the probability that something like that would ever happen? And then based on that assessment, how much time or energy do you need to put in trying to like solve for that potential risk? And if you're like really extreme on this, if you think there's even a tiny chance that this thing could end the world, then you need to focus all your attention on it. That being said, I believe that we've gone through a number of technological transformations over the last, many centuries. And this is just another one. Is it incredibly powerful? Will it affect everything that happens in the economy, from the way that our military operates, from the way we conduct national security, to the way that we deliver medicine, to the way that we travel the world? All these things will be impacted, yes. So to me, I think what's more important is to try to spend more of our time thinking about how we can deliver the benefits of these technologies to the American people more broadly, and ensure that our adversaries don't wield these technologies against our interests.
So I want to talk a lot about these issues and our adversaries and what we're doing and what we should be doing and how to create innovation. But I want to first talk about your own journey, right? So you most recently, prior to coming to Scale AI, were in the government. You were the CTO at the White House. You went over to the Department of Defense, senior official there responsible for research and the cutting edge of our technology. What made you decide to go to an AI company and why Scale?
Yeah, so I began my career in sort of the venture world. So I spent almost 7 years at Thiel Capital, which is Peter Thiel's investment firm in San Francisco. And during my time there, we spent a lot of time investing in companies that in some ways we're kind of pushing the envelope on where sort of regulation intersected with innovation. So you may think sort of the early 2010s, a lot of the wave of innovation was around things like self-driving vehicles, companies like Lyft, SpaceX, where you need all these approvals to be able to like launch rockets, Stripe and financial services. So in all these cases, we were as an investment firm thinking more and more about how sort of the regulatory apparatus can affect the potential sort of business applications. And to me, I became much more sort of interested in how we can essentially remove barriers to innovation broadly for the American people. And when President Trump was elected, I was very fortunate enough to have the opportunity to join that administration, and then get on the sort of other side of the fence and actually work on those regulations to kind of unlock this amazing potential we have in this country to drive and continue to be a leader in innovation. So as the administration wrapped up, I kind of looked back and said, hey, I've done some investing stuff, I've done some policy stuff, but one thing I had never done before was actually help build a company. And for those of you who work at startups, maybe in the audience, you don't, I'm sure but you don't know what it's like unless you're actually in the middle of that boiler room trying to get the job done. And no matter how glitzy or beautiful or how many magazine covers all these startups get, like it's a pretty hairy process behind the scenes. But you learn a lot about how to build stuff. And to me, I wanted to work at a company that was dual use. So essentially doing artificial intelligence, both for national security and for commercial purposes. And in scale was kind of where I've ended up. And it's been an amazing 3-year journey.
I do want to talk about the boiler room experience and how innovation happens in those companies and what impact, regulations have on that. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about this issue that you raised about regulation, right? And being on one side of it, when you're investing, and then on the other side of it in government, and then now on the receiving end of it in a company. And one of the things that's been driven, that's sort of this fear about AI, or this concern about AI, has driven a concern in the U.S. and a view by some policymakers, that this is a space we need to regulate in, and sooner rather than later, right? So you have the White House putting out a over 100-page executive order. You've got conversations going on Capitol Hill and on the Senate side with these inside forums. They're taking their time trying to understand the space, which actually is commendable, I think. But the goal at some point is to enact legislation. The EU has this AI Act where there's apparently a deal between the European Council and the European Parliament. We'll see how long that lasts. There have been some sort of bombs thrown in by the French of all people, so that's exciting, I think, So, but the question is, in a world in which innovation's happening rapidly, you were funding it back as a venture capitalist, you saw it in the government, you now are in a company where that innovation's happening. Should the government regulate rapidly?
Well, I think when I think about, if you step way back and you think about how regulations impact innovation, Adam Thayer kind of presented this framework that I've always kind of go back to, where it's like most technologies are either born in captivity or they're born free. And what that means is, if you're working in a space where your technology is born in captivity, you're designing a supersonic jet, which you are not allowed to fly American passengers on unless it's approved by the FAA. Or you're developing an autonomous vehicle and you're not allowed to put that on the road unless DOT gives you a stamp of approval. If you're creating AI-powered medical diagnostics, you're not allowed to use those with patients unless the FDA says go. So those are technologies that are born free. And then you have another set of technologies.
In captivity.
Sorry, born in captivity, yes. And then you have another set of technologies which are born free. And I think the typical example that you give is sort of the internet. And sort of what you saw was this new technology that no one had ever imagined before was created in the 90s. And it was allowed to sort of like grow. And you created this sort of like massive economic driver and a huge amount of innovation that was built kind of on the back of the internet. And obviously you have externalities and over time you sort of regulate some of those. So if you try to map that a little bit to kind of where we are with AI, I tend to view what's unique here is that, AI falls in that sort of born free technology.
Now.
Yes, right now. So the question now as a regulator is like, what do you do in that situation? Born free technologies are ones like, are ones where you're constantly coming up with ideas to chip away at it. So you think about like, privacy legislation for online internet providers, like an example of something that, has tried to be passed but never got done or whatnot. So to me, I think when you think about artificial intelligence, the best regulatory approach forward is to view it through the lens of already existing regulations. The idea, we have hundreds of years, 200 plus years of history in our country of being able to promulgate regulations and appropriately protect American citizens. And the first thing as a regulator you should always do before you want to do anything new is check what's on the book and see what's on the books and see how it applies going forward. And AI is so broad and it's like so sweeping. It could touch everything and every agency will be touched by it. So the idea that, a regulator could come up with sort of like one rule that can govern all of them, I think is very, very far-fetched. So if you dig one step further, the way I tend to view it is you want to create use case or sector-specific regulations. So in the case of the AI-powered medical diagnostic, the FDA has been approving medical diagnostics for years. They have a process of ensuring sort of the safety and security of those devices for the American people. And if you think about these sort of concentric circles of technology, AI is just sort of like one bubble out. So they can take the process they have and figure out how to make and ensure that particular medical diagnostic is safe. And the same thing goes for drones or self-driving cars or anything else. So to me, I think rather than think about it as AI needs to be regulated, you have to think about it from a use case standpoint. And I think kind of the last thing that a lot of people talk about in this domain is like, think about it in the case of wielding a tool. Like it is not illegal to buy a hammer, but it is really illegal to kill someone with a hammer. So the idea is you need to like not regulate the tools, but you regulate the end use case. And in this case, AI is going to be used for lots of use cases, and the regulators that are relevant should be thinking about it more closely.
So let's talk about some of those use cases, because you have a significant amount of experience, first investing in dual-use national security, now creating dual-use national security, and then you were doing the R&D for it and trying to figure out what our warfighters need, what our intelligence community needs, and whether AI or other leading-edge technologies can provide that. So let's talk about the application of AI in the intelligence and national security space. Is the intelligence community buying AI, and are they using it effectively? Should they be doing it differently? What about DOD? How should we differentiate between the two? Let's start with the IC.
Yeah, I think with the IC, you see people talking about AI, and that's typically what you see among most agencies when a new technology happens. You have leaders there, discussing how they could potentially use it or like try and develop plans. But I think, broadly speaking, it is not a technology that has been widely adopted by our intelligence community yet. And to me, I think that's a huge miss. And I think it's something that we as a country need to get a lot more focused on, because we know their adversaries are using it for these particular use cases. And in intelligence, you don't need to be an ML engineer or rocket science to understand how powerful this technology is. First, from just like a understanding what is out there standpoint. If you're an analyst and your job every day is to sort of track the cables that are coming in from, let's say, everywhere in Africa to bring some sort of like, holistic picture of what's going on and serve it up, like this is a perfect use case of an LLM. They can ingest that information and provide you summaries in dramatically faster time. If you think about sort of these like large corpuses of OSINT or sort of like open source intelligence that you have out there, a single analyst has no ability to be able to sift through that very easily. And there's lots of attempts at tools to sort of allow you to do that. But LLMs are the obvious technology that should be tested and applied to this. So on one front, it's like, how do we sort of empower our analysts to use the greatest tools we have today to be able to do their jobs better, more effectively for the safety of the country? And I think the other thing in Intel we have to be really, really, really aware of is the fact that our adversaries are using this, not only to do their own analysis, but to create offensive capabilities using LLMs. So a problem in broader intelligence community is like, how do you sift through the noise? How do you understand sort of like what's real from what's not? And if you're an adversary, you now essentially have an exquisite tool that can create an infinite amount of super high quality information pollution. So if you're tracking back to that Africa example, if you're a CCP and you want to make like super hard for that analyst to figure out what's going on, you can create lots and lots of content. So then it puts a lot of pressure on our agencies to create tools to be able to figure out how to detect what's real and what's not. So I think this is something that we need to like tackle head on and start running at pretty fast.
So if the applications are so obvious, and I agree, they're blindingly obvious. What is it? I mean, the intelligence community at times, historically, has been amongst the most lean forward on technology, developing some of the most cutting-edge capabilities that eventually then go over to DOD and are utilized at scale. Why isn't it happening? Is there something in the moment today? Is it something about the technology? Is it something about the culture? What is it that you think is going on that is causing this what might be viewed as a too slow adoption of a technology that has blinding obvious applicability?
Yeah, I will say I'm sure there are a number of people working very hard on this problem, and I commend them for that. I think just one thing that makes their job very difficult in doing this is one thing is broadly this concept of information silos. So in any type of sort of intel context, the value of an LLM is being able to search across large amounts of data, disparate data sets to bring you insights. By design, a lot of the way that the Intel system is organized is you have individual silos that are not speaking to each other. So
on purpose.
On purpose.
In part.
Yeah. So if you want to implement a technology that, its greatest benefit would be if you could just connect these two pipes together that for 30 years no one wanted to connect. You can see that it creates some friction in the building to kind of allow that to happen. I think the other thing, and I think it's a fair assessment too, is to think a little bit about sort of is there and could there be any sort of pollution that comes out from, or any sort of leakage, pollution that comes out from the uses of these models. So what you have to do is you have to find a way to deploy these models in high-side environments. So you have to sort of lift and shift these models.
On classified systems.
Yes, on classified systems that are sort of air-gapped so that anything you're trying to do doesn't necessarily leak out. And then back to the pipe connecting, if you want to insert OSINT or open source intel that's coming from general information in the world into that same pipeline, you can see that there's lots of sort of classification related challenges to sort of deploying these models. But I'm optimistic that technology can solve all those things. And if you have sort of the desire as a leader to make that a reality, I think it can easily be done.
And in fact, the very capabilities that LLMs have, right, that the tagging capabilities, the ability to identify where information assisted vector space can actually allow you to apply classification at a very granular level. Yes. It almost can solve part of that problem for you because it can digest the information, identify where it goes, and then output the relevant sort of information without crossing the streams in theory.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So why doesn't the IC get it?
Or
maybe they do. I'm not putting those. I don't want to put words in your mouth, right? I'm saying that, right? What do you think it would take to get the intelligence community to move faster in this space? Is it a leadership question? Is it a mindset question? Is it just a matter of time? Does the president need to put a foot down? What needs to change?
Well, as I look back at my time and I think about where did things get done, I think the obvious number one thing is you need high-level political buy-in and desire to get it done. So most times when you're a political administration, you come in for maybe 2, maybe 3 years. The advice you probably should get if you haven't gotten it is you probably should only set 1 to 3, maybe max priorities and run really, really hard at those and get those done because you could essentially spend 3 years running around doing talks like this and just hanging out, and before you know it, time is finished. So I think to me, if you have actual political buy-in as this is a top priority for you, I think that can go a very long way. And I think the other thing is just a little bit, just a mindset shift. Being more open to the idea that sort of combining these different data sets together could provide real and valuable insight. And maybe that, and sometimes I think about it, it's pressure on the private sector to be able to show that to the IC, show them that it's possible, bring them, examples of where it could be used, and maybe use data sets that are out in the public to show that this is pretty amazing tool.
Well, one would think that 25 years nearly after 9/11, and when we talked about the need to share information and take down the sort of need to know and make it need to share, you'd think that maybe we might work our way around that, but clearly not yet. Now, folks, just so you know, we will have time for questions, so be thinking about your questions. We'll come to you here shortly. But I want to pivot from the IC for a second to the Department of Defense. So Department of Defense has its own challenges in adopting new technology and new capability. It's at some level, it creates some amazing, innovative new capabilities. At the same time, this is an area where perhaps the DOD has its own challenges. Yep. Those come in a couple of forms, right? There may be some of these same cultural issues. There may be some of these same classification issues. But on top of that, there's also an issue that the IC has less of, which is how do you buy? So talk to us about the Department of Defense and how they're doing on AI, whether they're leaning forward more, and what are some of the challenges you see in that domain, and how might we solve some of them?
Yeah, so Captain Lugo, I think, was here in the first session. I didn't get to hear his whole talk, but in general, there's the CDAO, which is the main sort of focal point at the DoD for data and AI. and they've launched an effort around large language models, and they're doing a lot of work, and they're essentially like try to set sort of OSD or sort of secretary department-wide guidance on how to use these LLMs in a sort of safe and secure way. I think so I continue to applaud them for that, and I think the area why I'm sort of more excited about, or I'm excited about how the DoD can progress through this is, there's no reason to sort of jump to the end of the line and try to sort of apply these LLMs to sort of like, very specific warfighter needs, in conflict at the moment. There is so much sort of like back office or other work that can be used. You can use LLMs as far less. You could, I guess, less risky. So in that case, you can sort of,
because everyone's worried about the drone that kills the, right? Ever heard the story about, right? Did you guys hear the story? Tell us a little about this drone killing the operator story. You know what I'm talking about? So there was a DOD mid-level officer who told a story at a conference like this about a test they had run, as he described it, and I'll correct the story in a second, but a test that they had run where they had a drone controlled by artificial intelligence that's goal was to kill it, was to destroy the target, but it had to obey the directions of its commander. Ultimately, it decided the way to prosecute the target, because it had a reward function, was to kill the operator so that it could ultimately kill the target, right? This was the story he told. What he failed to mention was this was not an actual test. Nobody got killed. There was no actual attempt by a drone to even run it out. It was a thought experiment about what might happen if you created a reward function like that and gave it to a AI-controlled thing. And so all these newspapers reported this as oh my God, DOD is training killer drones to kill operators, when in fact it was just a thought experiment and everyone had to issue corrections. But this is the kind of story that's going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, people tend to kind of take it to an extreme, and
right.
I think that the DoD is a massive organization, spends $850 billion. It's sort of the largest employer in the United States. There's so many use cases where you could attempt to use LLMs to sort of make the job of our warfighter and the folks sort of supporting them easier and better.
That have nothing to do with weapon systems.
That has nothing to do with weapon system. This is like daily report. This is like weekly report writing. This is like managing sort of supply chain of everything. I mean, there's just so many use cases you could use in it. And to me, I think it's exciting that LLMs are being deployed at the Pentagon. The question is just how the problem that we face generally in LLMs is that there's no budget to purchase or use LLMs today. This is a new technology. It sort of essentially just got sort of started last year or whatever. So everyone's trying to figure out, are there a way that I can reprogram or use my existing funds to like maybe try some of this Gen AI stuff? So the question is like over the next year or two, will you see sort of specific line items and dollars that go directly toward Gen AI use cases?
And what's your theory? Will we?
I hope so. I think what the DoD and to some extent sort of the private sector needs to do a better job of is communicating to Congress what are kind of the top, 3, 4, 5, 6 different areas where this could be used, and give them specificity on like what parts of the department could benefit most, rather than just sort of like blanket, we should do more Gen AI. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that one of the biggest concerns you have in the national security domain when it comes to the use of AI is this gap between what we're doing, whether it's the intelligence community or the Department of Defense, and what our adversaries are doing. What can you tell us about the way our adversaries are thinking about the use of artificial intelligence, the uses they're making of it, and whether that's going to put us at a disadvantage from a national security perspective?
Yeah, so I think that tracking CCP use and funding of artificial intelligence has been something that's been going on for years now. I remember, there are lots of reports coming out in sort of 2017, 2018 about sort of this massive dollar spending by the CCP on developing the AI ecosystem. The U.S. came out with their strategy. President Trump doubled spending on artificial intelligence by the federal government, and sort of this like tit for tat kind of continued. And I think sort of the pre-LLM, the broad cut on it was that China was really good on computer vision, and if you wanted to like track people with cameras, they were like really, really good at that. And most other domains within sort of larger AI was the U.S. continued to lead. We still have the most researchers, we have the best universities, we have the most startups. You can rattle off the numbers we continue to lead on. But the question is, is there accelerations or is it going to come to a point where at some point they're going to catch up with us? And then kind of LLMs happen. And I think LLMs proved that, once again, the U.S. is pretty in a league of its own here. And, when ChatGPT came out and what OpenAI was able to do was something was leaps and bounds ahead of where the Chinese were. Now, over time, over the last probably 18 months, you've seen them catch up. In the last 3 or 4 months, they have a couple of models now that kind of sit on the sort of top 10 or within the top 10 of these language model rankings that people tend to look at.
The Chinese do.
The Chinese do.
Yeah.
And I think when I think about kind of, the interesting thing about large language models is they're actually not that hard to build. You and I probably couldn't do it, but
that's for sure.
The recipe is generally known. You go out and you scrape the entire internet for all the data that exists. You sort of pump it through a bunch of GPUs. That creates a pre-trained model, and then from there you go, you tweak it a little bit through a process called fine tuning, and then out comes the model. So that's why the Emiratis have created a model called Falcon. That's why Mistral, this French model, exists, and why the French suddenly are more pro DRAG. But in any case,
in a hot minute, that thing flipped.
Yeah, the moment they have a national champion, they flip. But so you can see that lots of countries around the world now are developing their own models. So back to the China example, I think what's most important for us is to keep allowing and keeping in mind that if we try to restrict the progress in some ways of some of these large language model developers, we know our adversaries aren't, and that's something we always have to keep in mind, because I'm not saying we should be developing unsafe and untrustworthy models. What I am saying is that our adversaries are creating unsafe and untrustworthy models, and they're running like crazy on it. And those are the types of models that can and will be used by the PLA.
And I do want to go to the audience for questions, but before we do, I want to wrap back around to where we began. So you just mentioned that we need to ensure that we continue to lead in this space, that we need to continue to innovate the way we have historically. And you start with that great analogy of technology born in captivity and technology born free. We're now in a scenario where we have a technology that was born free, right? This artificial intelligence capability, LLMs in particular, born free here in the United States. We're now talking about maybe starting to box that free animal in a bit, and put some guardrails around it. And there's a couple of models you might think of, right? You might have the government come in and regulate using its regulatory authority that exists. You might create new regulations. There might be new statutes. You might also look to private industry to think about these issues of trust, safety, security. You might look to investors. You might look to the venture capital community. You might look to the innovators at companies like Scale AI. What's the right model? Let's assume that we all agree that there is concern about AI, right? Whether overblown or not. And so trust, safety, and security is an important value that we want to keep in mind. At the same time, we definitely don't want to kill innovation, and we definitely want to continue to lead.
Yeah.
What's the best model for thinking about how to do that thing?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. I think one kind of broad idea is generally you try to you use industry-led consortia that can then develop testing and evaluation and in sort of red teaming or other ways of standards around benchmarking these models amongst themselves. And these large model developers are pretty incentivized, not to royally screw up. They're competing with one another.
Why is that? Because I think there's an assumption that the profit motive does not incentivize them the right way. Why is that wrong?
Well, what you have to think about the way, yes, we all log into ChatGPT and kind of play around with it, but the real revenue that's going to be coming from all of these models is individual enterprises or new businesses creating fine-tuned versions of these base models. So you have this base model that's GPT-4, and then it's fine-tuned to a particular use case that some investment bank or some insurance company or some hospital wants to use. And then that fine-tuned model, which is specific to the data at that particular enterprise, is what ultimately is going to be used. And the OpenAI is going to drive revenue by how much data is pumped through that fine-tuned model. So all these base models are highly incentivized to be the base model that every enterprise and everyone else who wants to build AI chooses as the model of choice. So if you create a model which is constantly screwing up or saying horrible things or acting in a way
or getting in trouble with your regulators,
or misbehaving, you wouldn't want to do that. If I start a company today, I would want to use a model that I can trust and build a model on top of. It's going to produce great results for my end customer. So there is a real incentive, I think, to kind of be a good actor here and work together on this stuff. That being said, I mean, we have a standards organization at NIST. You've already started work on some of these artificial intelligence standards, and in some sense, they're important in the more sort of like geopolitical context, where we want our U.S. standards to be the de facto standards that are used across Europe, across South America, across Africa, especially across sort of these global South areas where we have the CCP competing for influence there. We want our standards to be the lead there. So there is some sort of, some private sector and some government action that can be taken.
So markets can actually work.
Yes.
Okay. So questions for the audience. We've got 20 minutes. I've got plenty more questions if you all have questions, but I bet you all do. So who wants to go over? Sir, here in the front. And I think we have mics that may come to you here in a second, but go ahead. You're in the front. We can hear you. Here we go. A mic is coming your way imminently.
You mentioned drones, and I thought you were going to talk about the drone that took out the U.S. Servicemen, I guess, in Jordan. And it seems to me that would have been an obvious use of artificial intelligence, detecting what was real, whether it was ours or whether it was not. Is that a failure of thinking about how to use it, or we're just not up to par? The technology couldn't achieve that?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics about that, what technology was being used at that tower, but I will say there are ways to be able to detect friendlies from not, and I think there's a lot of work being done in the sort of larger AI community in trying to use these sort of counter drone techniques. It's an area that the sort of DOD has invested in quite a bit, and then Ukraine happened, and they're investing in it quite a lot. So you can use directed energy to knock these out of the sky. You can use actual physical drones that go up and hit them. So there's lots of different techniques you can use. But I think the core to your question is you have to be able to know, what's a friendly and what's not before you can even take action. And I think there's lots of techniques you can use for that as well.
Sir, right there.
So I'm going to play good cop, bad cop with the DOD.
Are you the good or the bad cop?
I'm both.
You're both.
Yes. So firstly, I think we're, could you move that a little bit? I think we're selling DOD short on the database management and even quasi-AI, because forever they've had targeting systems, dials. I don't know if you remember dials. I do. Defense Intelligence Agency online system, which gave a target designation to every kind of target you can imagine around the globe. I used it extensively in 4 different theaters of operation. So I think we're closer to using AI than we think, because dials is like 25 years old. Sure. And I think our guys, they're no dummies. These guys are working hard, you know that. And they're figuring out how to automate and use AI within the dial system or whatever this is managing now. So, bad cop. I just quit a job after a month as the DOD cybersecurity architect. The reason I quit is because I'm an architect, a cyber architect, and their reference architectures are horrible, and you can find them online. The one for the strategic reference architecture for cyber and the zero trust architecture. Well, I tried to convince the leadership through the contractor I was working for that they're just bad. They're not architecture documents, and they're not focused on the warfighter. They don't bring their architecture documents down to the commands. Read up on it, you can find it. So I resigned. And so NIST. I have a love-hate relationship with NIST. NIST, those guys and gals are so great. They do so much work, but they do too much work. If you pick up NIST documents, especially their new AI document, it's like reading ancient Greek, because you can't apply their documentation. And then going back to the White House, bad cop. Hold on, I'm not finished.
I know.
No, I have an observation. I'm about to finish.
Yeah.
So the executive orders coming out of the White House, they touch like 5 agencies, DISA and CISA, they get excited, but no one else does. So the bottom line is if we have all these dynamics going, and we have the executive orders that you probably wrote some of them, and there's no way to make this a holistic environment. NIST doesn't really work with the DOD. DOD isn't working with the commands. And everyone's doing their own thing when it comes to AI. So how do we pull it all together in a holistic architectural solution, both for the citizens of the United States and to support our warfighters and to defeat the enemy? And yes, AI probably would, in the next year or so, figure out which drone was landing at the time over the site.
So this is a great question, right? Do we need, the White House's typical answer to this, right, and is let's create a czar, right? Do we need an AI czar that's higher up than Ben Buchanan is at the White House right now? Do we need an AI czar that can direct kind of change? Does that even work? Is there a way to solve this very real problem that the question identified?
Yeah, I think the reality is this is something that isn't exclusive to AI. I think in every administration, there's efforts around all sorts of things that, I guess the whole role of the White House, or what's sort of unique and probably amazing about the U.S. system is that sort of, a lot of policy is very diffused across multiple agencies. Yeah. So, if you want to say I prioritize AI research, in most governments you would just point to the Ministry of Science and be like, spend more money on AI.
Go do X.
Yeah, but in our system, you have National Science Foundation, you have our DOE labs, you have DARPA, you have NTIA, you have all these agencies,
all the works, software,
exactly.
DIU.
So to some extent, I mean, the reality is back to sort of like political will.
Yeah.
It comes and rests within the White House apparatus. Like, will it be a priority for the White House to have a functioning and running PCC or like policy process that meets every week, and that every assistant secretary that's associated with this particular topic shows up every day on Tuesday, and they deliver the results that the president calls for. It's not the most beautiful solution, but it's the way that typically things operate.
So we've seen a policy process of the White House on sort of AI concerns, constraints, regulation. Are you seeing a policy process kicking off on deploy AI, get it out there, make it usable for the American people? Because some of that's in the AI executive order as well. Are we seeing a real policy process around the lean forward part?
I mean, to some extent. I mean, they've done some work around trying to bring in AI talent into the U.S. government, for example.
Yep.
I think a lot of the efforts around the executive order were centered around these trying to find a way to start thinking about managing the risks.
Yeah.
Whether it's like calling for very specific disclosures from large language model.
10 to the 26th power.
Yeah, you gotta meet some threshold that some people decided was the right one. But we don't know if it'll be the right one in a year or 2 years or maybe.
Or 8 seconds from now.
Exactly, yes. But I think from I do think there's a general genuine sentiment there that AI should be more diffused across industry, and it should be better used. Yeah. So we'll see, but it's quite a lot. I think they joke that it's the longest EO that I think this president has ever signed.
Ever, I think.
Yeah. And if you look a couple days ago, they released kind of an update on kind of what they've accomplished since it was signed, and trying to check off the
status report,
47 reports that were called for or whatnot. But
other questions? Yes, sir. Right here. I see back there. And by the way, we're doing 2 recordings, which is why there's a second microphone. So we got the one for the room audience and one for sort of the public record.
Sure. So we tend to have this conversation around AI as a thing that we can put a box around, right?
Yeah.
And I am a part of conversations like this all the time, kind of leading an AI practice for a large company. And yet, I can't help but think that AI is going to become ubiquitously plugged into every system that we are using across government and as part of the national security space. So this attempt to kind of think about AI in a box like we are, is this just fundamentally a different kind of conversation we're going to need to start having than AI is this contained thing?
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think as I talked a little bit about how I think about the right regulatory approach, where it's use case and sector specific, you shouldn't be talking about AI as a thing. You should be talking about the use case that may or may not use AI. Sort of the next cars that are designed in 3 or 4 years will probably have a bunch of different like AI stuff running in them. You're not talking about AI. You're just talking about regulating this new or approving this new vehicle. So I think you're right. I think the practical challenge in the short term is that, getting people to figure out how to apply this ubiquitous thing to their specific use cases at individual agencies requires some sort of like forcing function, or else it doesn't quite happen. But I think over time, I think things will definitely move in the direction that you say.
That's a great point. Yeah, back there. Oh, I'll come to you. I'll come to you next, ma'am. Thank you for flying. Thank you. Apologies, I didn't see you back there. We'll get you next right after this, gentleman. We'll bring the mic over that way, ma'am.
Thanks for your time. Max Bodak with Foundation for American Innovation. So you talked a little bit about the national security risks around standards and how we want the U.S. to be in a leadership role here. Do you see the European regulatory approach as posing certain risks for the U.S. AI companies in a similar way that like has happened with like social media regulation, where Europe has actually leapfrogged the U.S. and is taking a much more active role in regulation in social media? Do you think that's also going to play a role in how this is implemented for like AI within the national security application? And could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think I would probably not use the leapfrog terminology, because it implies we're actually like trying to all get there and they've jumped ahead of us.
As though we're behind,
Yeah,
right? People seem to say, like GDPR, we're so far behind Europe on privacy.
No, we're a place we should be on that. But
I think you just need to look at innovation numbers, right? Investment, anything like startup creation.
Oh, totally. And I think that's kind of the main. It's like just look at the scoreboard. I mean, the number of sort of tech unicorns that have been created over the last 20 years is abysmal in Europe. And I think obviously there's a cultural element to it, where it's sort of like generally risk taking is something that is sort of much more ingrained in the American sort of like way of doing things than necessarily European. But I do actually think there's some risk for American companies as the Europeans sort of run ahead with this expedition in made up regulations. I think what I find astounding as like a policymaker is, the technology has barely been developed. We don't even understand quite how it's coming together. Yet suddenly we have an all-encompassing EU AI Act that should, serve for the betterment of the European people for the next decade. And to me, there's like, I know what it feels like to sit at that table to try to put like pen to paper on these rules, and you just can't do that in a smart and effective way. So I'm a little bit worried because I think there's going to be a push by Europe to continue to try to contain the growth of this stuff, and ultimately the biggest players are American.
Yeah. Bam.
Okay, my question is, you mentioned the problem with the drone and the horrible thing that happened over, I guess it was Jordan, but you also mentioned that part of the government is that we have all these competing stakeholders, even though we're all using AI. What is the plan to find out and disseminate the differences between the stakeholders so we don't have that problem? Example, just taking an example, you want a house. You know what you want, how comfortable you want it. You want a big bathroom. Then you have the plumber. The plumber says this is what you need, but the architect doesn't put enough distance between the walls to have the appropriate plumbing for the bathtub shower spa that you need. Seems like this is just the general problem with the government. We know we want a house, but we don't investigate each individual stakeholders. And the reason I'm here is, thank you, Catholic University. I was one of the first IT graduates here, BA IT graduates, and I'm in the healthcare legal field, and I see how we're using this to read legal documents, and it's bad news, and it's not good for the consumers. It's coming up wrong. So I want to know, because there's different stakeholders. We don't want to pay people, but we want to give. Anyway, it's just a convoluted thing when it comes to healthcare, and we're getting dripped down from DARPA to healthcare. We're basically getting whatever you guys didn't want. They're sending it over to our healthcare agency. So what are you doing about competing stakeholders so you'll have a better, final product.
Yeah, how do we reconcile these different concerns that people have and these challenges and different agendas that people might have?
Yeah, so I think there's some forcing functions within the federal government that try to solve this. So OMB is tasked, for example, to put out, more standardized guidance about if you're ever going to be doing, a regulation on something that involves artificial intelligence, or what are the types of things you as a regulator should be thinking about. It's not sort of specific about what you should do, but like these are the considerations you should have. So in some sense, across multiple agencies, you're all going to be like singing from the same song sheet, if you will, on the types of things you should,
In theory,
you should be thinking about. And it goes back to this sort of like unifying effort by some body, whether it be the White House or someone else, to sort of adjudicate the types of things you're talking about. And the whole, as silly as it sounds, when you get two people in the same room from different agencies, they're talking about the same issue, it tends to come up. Like we did a lot of work around commercial drones for the United States, and like that's a problem that is not an FAA problem. It's FAA plus DHS plus lots of other folks. DOE is concerned about drones flying over sort of nuclear facilities, whatever it may be. So you have to get all those people in the same room together to ultimately come up to the right policy answer.
So we've got about 3 more minutes. We got time for about 2 or 3 more questions. Ma'am, do you have one in the front? No? No? Okay, sir, you're in the back, and then back.
So related to that previous question, so talking at that's the big stakeholder picture, but then talking about deploying things, there's a lot of tools out there which we can stitch together into something that we can use, which I'm doing in my day job. But then companies are building platforms because there's more to AI than just one tool. You have to stitch these together to make something effective. For a small company, I can see going to a platform because they don't have the manpower or the time or the resources to necessarily stitch all these tools together. But for something like the U.S. government or even one of the departments, we probably have the time, resources, and manning, if we allocate it, to stitch these things together. So is it better for us at the federal level to be looking at platforms or going for the tools so we can be more customized, but then that means much less integration across the
You're asking somebody who has a platform company, right?
Well, we do a little bit of both. So I would say I don't think it's either or. I think it is kind of a cop out, but I think it's use case specific. And I think one thing that I applaud CDAO to sort of thinking about is this concept of AI scaffolding. So the idea that no matter what AI project you're doing, there are certain, like, AI is not just like a platform or like an algorithm or like a model. Like doing AI well requires you to have a whole lot of components that all fit together. You need your data, then you need data to be cleaned and optimized and made AI ready. Then you need to sort of train the model. Then you need to like test and evaluate the model, then figure out where it's not working, then go get more data. Then, so it's like there's all these pieces. And I think a centralized group like CDAO creating this AI scaffolding. So anyone who's endeavoring on an AI project knows that it's not just like, do I pick company A or B, but rather I need to make sure that I can fit this holistic picture to have a successful AI program.
Awesome. I saw one last question, then I'll come down here. So two questions right there. Yes, you, sir. Yep. And then down here, this will be our last question.
Right, so I'm thinking especially from the perspective of analysts who are dealing with information sort of on the ground and sort of wondering what their relationship to like an LLM helping them sift through massive amounts of information, detecting patterns, which is what those programs are really good at, and thinking of the cases where sort of the movement of the enemy or something is not constitutive of a pattern. Like it's not actually something that an LLM is saying there's a high degree of certainty that something will happen, but people on the ground, for example, are saying, I don't know what to tell you, it's a gut feeling, but I think something that there's a lot of noise in the pattern, but something is happening there. How will the sort of the use of artificial intelligence in having to sift through lots of information, how will that change sort of the relationship of the analyst to the LLM when it's detecting patterns? Especially, and this might be a bit projecting, especially when you have the potential of enemies using other LLMs to sort of produce noise inside the patterns of behavior. So I'm sort of curious how you think of the confidence that an analyst has, especially when there's the potential to add noise to certain pattern recognition tools.
Yeah, totally. We talked about it a little bit. I mean, our adversaries certainly are creating sort of noise pollution, if you will. I think I would take this more as an iterative process that over time will improve. So the very first use case that you would have as an analyst for an LLM is not to sort of adjudicate whether or not, your human intel should be outweighed by the pattern that was sort of described by the historical whatever. I think there are ways that you can like slowly get to that, and the technology will progress. But I think you got to think about the uses in this sort of like crawl, walk, run scenario. And over time, we may get there, and there's probably lots of technology you can use to fine-tune models to be able to make sure that it's like, answering questions appropriately and giving all the right feedback and giving you confidence. But I think it's more of a broadly sort of baby steps to get to where you want to be.
But what about this fear that human analysts might rely too much upon sort of the LLM and the capabilities that it provides, and sort of stand down their own instincts and say, well, but all the patterns are telling me this other thing, even though my gut tells me it's the other way, I'm going to go with what the machine's telling me.
Yeah,
do we worry about that? Do we worry about that?
I think some people definitely do. I mean, you can imagine. Many of you have probably seen the some of the stuff that's come out on drivers who use autopilot on their Tesla. So the first day they're like, they turn on autopilot, but their like hands are like kind of hovering over the steering wheel. They're like focused. Their eyes aren't moving. They're not checking their phone. And then literally like 3 days later, they're just like, they're texting. They're like talking to their friend.
They're over it.
Yeah. And it's like happens like that. I mean, it's wild. So I think we as humans need to be sort of, we need to be aware that, where we potentially create blind spots by reliance on technology. But I'm more optimistic, again, the we can build this technology to be able to sort of like understand the shortcomings of the users.
And allow us to focus on the higher order thinking.
100%, yeah.
All right, last question.
Thanks so much. This has been great. I'm curious, one element of kind of the AI like triad of like data, algorithm, but then also like the hardware, like the compute power. How were you thinking about that during your time in government, as kind of we saw like a buildup of like certain GPUs or certain like just like compute power capabilities? And is there a way that we can think about actually kind of deploying governance or like safety or like even things like export controls on chip governance? Like, is there a way of utilizing the hardware to advance kind of like the U.S. kind of in the U.S.-China tech competition?
Yeah, I mean, GPUs were kind of discussed during my time. I think they obviously took off when these LLMs became a thing a year and a half ago. This realization that you would need sort of massive clusters of these high-end GPUs in order to train the models
Because of the parallel computing power they provide.
Yes, yeah, and ultimately, this realization led to the Commerce Department, you're doing export controls on these high-end chips to try to restrict access of these chips to the CCP and its affiliates. So there's general understanding that you need these chips. But now, anyone, I'm by no means an export control expert, but for anyone who plays in that space, enforcing these export controls is like really, really hard. I mean, BIS is like a small little organization. It wasn't designed for this. If you don't know if someone who's bought a chip then can sell it to someone who's not supposed to have it, how do you monitor that? So back to your question, it's are there ways you could actually build in controls in the chip themselves, so you have some understanding of sort of what's being run on it and by who. And that's a technology that I think a lot of the chip companies are sort of thinking about. You can imagine there's another more sort of, libertarian bend to a lot of chip developers that are like, why should I can do whatever I want with this chip. I bought it. So I think
there's this memory of the Clipper chip debacle.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think at the end of the day, broadly, at least in my opinion, attempting to sort of choke off access by the CCP to these high-end chips is like critical for us now. But I think we all need to be very like realist about it. Like the window where we have this advantage is not infinite. At some point they'll be able to develop chips that can compete just as well. And over time, the price of all this stuff will also be dropping.
In that scenario, is there a value in us trying to get them addicted to our technology? I mean, some of the chip manufacturers will come to you and say, well, no, let us sell. Then they'll be buying our stuff, and then you can figure out how to figure out what they're doing on those chips. It's better for them to buy ours than develop their own native capability.
Yeah, that's one. That is an argument. I think the question is, in this short-term window of the next 2 to 3 years, we cannot, or one would argue, should not give them that advantage.
Yeah, awesome. Michael, thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great conversation.